The afternoon of June 14th, 1939, started like any other Wednesday in Harlem. The summer heat had settled over Lenox Avenue like a heavy blanket, and by 3:47 p.m., the sidewalks outside the Red Rooster were crowded with locals, street vendors, and men conducting business in hushed tones. Among them stood Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, a man whose reputation had preceded him through every borough of New York City for the better part of a decade. What happened in the next 60 seconds would change the power structure of organized crime in Manhattan forever. Witnesses later told police that Joey Sabatini, a capo in the Genovese crime family, had been drinking since noon. He crossed 135th Street with 3 men flanking him, their suits crisp despite the weather, their eyes scanning the crowd with the casual arrogance of men who believed they owned every inch of concrete their shoes touched. Sabatini was known for 2 things: his connection to Vito Genovese and his absolute contempt for anyone who wasn't Italian. Bumpy was standing outside the barber shop, talking to Willie, the Hammer Ferguson, and 2 other numbered runners. He was 32 years old at the time, 6 feet tall, with a presence that made crowds part without him saying a word. According to James Turner, a shoeshine operator who watched the entire encounter unfold, Sabatini walked directly up to Bumpy, pointed at him, and said something about colored boys forgetting their place. Then Joey Sabatini slapped Bumpy Johnson across the face. The sound, Turner later said, was like a gunshot. The entire block went silent. Street vendors stopped calling out their wares. A dice game froze mid-roll. Even the traffic seemed to pause. Sabatini's men were grinning, waiting for Bumpy to react, waiting for an excuse to pull the revolvers hidden beneath their jackets. But Bumpy didn't move. He stood there, his jaw clenched, a red mark forming on his left cheek. His eyes locked on his Sabatini's. 5 seconds passed, then 10. The silence stretched so long that people later described it as suffocating, like the air itself was holding its breath. 2 uniformed NYPD officers, Patrolman Michael O'Reilly and his partner, Robert Shin, were stationed less than 40 feet away. They'd seen everything. Protocol dictated they intervene. Assault in broad daylight. Multiple witnesses. Cut and dried. Neither officer moved. O'Reilly would later tell his sergeant that something in Bumpy's stillness made him wait. It wasn't fear, he said in his incident report, which surfaced decades later in the NYPD archives. It was something else, like watching a bomb decide whether to explode. After what felt like an eternity, Bumpy Johnson smiled. Not a friendly smile, not even an angry one. It was the kind of smile that made Joey Sabatini's grin disappear. Bumpy adjusted his hat, nodded slowly, and walked away without saying a single word. The crowd exhaled. Vendors returned to their calls. The dice game resumed. But everyone who'd witnessed the exchange knew they just watched something that couldn't be undone. In the world Bumpy inhabited, where reputation was currency and disrespect was a death sentence, walking away from a public humiliation wasn't weakness. It was a declaration of war. What Sabatini didn't know, what the police didn't know, and what would only become clear in the days that followed, was that Bumpy Johnson had already decided exactly how he would respond. Not with his fists, not with a gun, but with something far more devastating to a man like Joey Sabatini. Silence, after all, can be the loudest threat of all. To understand what happened after that slap, you first need to understand who Bumpy Johnson was before June 14th, 1939, and how a boy from South Carolina became the most feared man in Harlem without ever serving a major crime family. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born on October 31st, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina. His family moved to Harlem in 1919, part of the Great Migration that saw over 6 million Black Americans flee the Jim Crow South between 1916 and 1970. Bumpy was 14 years old when he arrived on 139th Street, carrying nothing but a cardboard suitcase and a reputation for never backing down from a fight. His nickname came from a physical deformity, a large bump on the back of his head, the result of a childhood injury. Kids mocked him for it. He put 3 of them in the hospital within his first month in New York. By 1921, at 16, he was running errands for a local gambler named William Hewitt. By 1923, he'd been arrested twice for assault and once for grand larceny. But it was his relationship with Stephanie St. Clair, the woman known as Queenie or Madam Queen, that transformed Bumpy from a street enforcer into a power player. Stephanie St. Clair was extraordinary by any measure. Born in Martinique around 1897, she'd arrived in Harlem in 1912 and built the most profitable numbers racket in Manhattan by 1923. The numbers game, an illegal lottery where people bet pennies on 3-digit combinations, was Harlem's economic lifeblood during the Depression. Stephanie controlled it all: the runners, the banks, the payoffs, and most importantly, the politicians and police who looked the other way. She met Bumpy in 1928 when he was 23 and already developing a reputation as someone who could enforce discipline without unnecessary bloodshed. She was 31, brilliant, calculating, and under constant pressure from Italian mobsters who wanted to muscle into her territory. According to FBI surveillance reports from 1932, Stephanie saw something in Bumpy that others missed. He wasn't just violent, he was strategic. Their relationship was complicated. Some historians claim they were romantically involved. Others insist it was purely professional. What's documented is this: between 1928 and 1935, Bumpy became Stephanie's chief enforcer, her strategist, and eventually her partner. He protected her runners from stick-up crews. He negotiated with corrupt precinct captains. He made problems disappear. And when Dutch Schultz, the vicious bootlegger and gangster, tried to take over Harlem's numbers in 1931, Bumpy was the one who orchestrated resistance. Dutch Schultz, born Arthur Flegenheimer, was one of the most violent criminals in New York history. By 1931, Prohibition had made him extraordinarily wealthy, but he wanted more. Harlem's numbers game generated an estimated $20 million annually, equivalent to roughly $400 million today. Schultz saw that money and decided it belonged to him. His method was simple: intimidation, violence, and murder. Between 1931 and 1935, over 40 numbers runners were beaten or killed by Schultz's enforcers. Stephanie St. Clair fought back through legal channels and street resistance, but she was losing ground. The Italian mob had more guns, more men, and more political connections than she could ever match. This is where the mythology around Bumpy gets complicated. Popular accounts claim Bumpy single-handedly fought Dutch Schultz. The truth, according to NYPD reports and contemporary newspaper accounts, is more nuanced. Bumpy didn't fight Schultz directly. Nobody could. Instead, he protected key members of Stephanie's operation, maintained discipline when others wanted to flee, and executed targeted strikes against Schultz's most aggressive enforcers. On October 23, 1935, Dutch Schultz was assassinated in a Newark chop house. The hit was ordered by the Commission, the governing body of Italian-American crime families, because Schultz had become too erratic and wanted to murder District Attorney Thomas Dewey, which would have brought federal heat down on everyone. Schultz's death didn't free Harlem from mob control. It simply changed which mob family was in charge. The Genovese family, the Luciano family, and others divided up Schultz's former territories. They offered Stephanie St. Clair a deal. She could keep operating, but she'd pay tribute and follow their rules. Stephanie eventually retreated from the numbers business, exhausted and outgunned. But Bumpy stayed. By 1939, he'd carved out an unusual position. He wasn't Italian, so he could never be a made man. But he was too valuable, too connected, and too dangerous to eliminate. He worked with the mob when it suited him, protected Harlem's black-owned operations when he could, and maintained a careful balance that kept him alive and prosperous. Which brings us back to Joey Sabatini and that slap. Sabatini represented a new generation of Italian mobsters who'd grown up after the Prohibition Wars, who didn't remember when Harlem had been controlled by black operators like Stephanie St. Clair, and who viewed Bumpy Johnson as nothing more than a well-dressed errand boy. Sabatini had been sent to Harlem by his superiors to collect tribute and ensure operations ran smoothly. He thought slapping Bumpy in public would remind everyone who was really in charge. He was wrong. The hours after the slap were, on the surface, unervingly normal. Joey Sabatini returned to his headquarters, a social club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, and celebrated with his crew. According to Anthony Little Tony DeMarco, who was present that evening and later testified in an unrelated racketeering trial, Sabatini was convinced he'd humiliated Bumpy so thoroughly that the black gangster would never show his face in Harlem again. Joey thought he'd broken him, DeMarco recalled. Kept saying, "That's how you teach them respect." Meanwhile, Bumpy returned to his apartment on 133rd Street. He didn't rage. He didn't drink. He didn't call his associates for an emergency meeting. Instead, according to his longtime companion, Mamie Hatcher Johnson, whom he'd married in 1948, Bumpy spent the evening reading and playing chess with a neighborhood kid named Thomas who often visited. He was quieter than usual, Mamie said in a 1992 interview with the New York Amsterdam News. But he wasn't upset. He was thinking. The NYPD, however, was neither quiet nor calm. Lieutenant Frank Mancini, the commanding officer of the 32nd Precinct, called an emergency briefing at 11 p.m. on June 14th. According to internal memos obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests in 2003, Mancini was terrified of what would happen next. "We have a powder keg," he wrote in his report to headquarters. "Johnson won't let this stand, and when he moves, people will die. We need additional units on standby." Captain William Foster, one of the few black officers in the NYPD at the time, disagreed with Mancini's assessment. Foster had grown up in Harlem and understood its social dynamics better than most of his colleagues. "Johnson doesn't operate like Sabatini," Foster wrote in his own memo. "If something happens, it won't be what we expect." Foster was right, but not in the way anyone anticipated. June 15th came and went. No shootings, no bodies, no retaliation. June 16th was equally quiet. Sabatini conducted business as usual. His runners collected money. His enforcers made their rounds. He even returned to Harlem briefly to oversee a gambling operation on 125th Street, strutting through the neighborhood like a victorious general touring conquered territory. Bumpy, meanwhile, was barely seen. A few witnesses reported him having coffee at the Savoy Ballroom. Another claimed to see him talking with Madame Stephanie St. Clair, who'd retired from active operations but still commanded respect. But there were no confrontations, no public statements, no shows of force. The silence was driving everyone insane. If you subscribe now, you'll join thousands of history lovers uncovering the real stories behind legendary moments. Stories that never made it into textbooks but shaped the world we know today. Street-level operators who worked for both sides grew nervous. Numbers runners started carrying guns, convinced they'd be caught in crossfire. Bookies hedged their bets, unsure whether to side with Italian power or Harlem loyalty. Even corrupt police officers, who normally took payoffs from both factions, started avoiding certain blocks, worried about being seen with the wrong people at the wrong time. Detective Harold Weiss, who'd been investigating organized crime in Harlem since 1936, later wrote in his unpublished memoirs that the 2 days after the slap were the most unsettling 48 hours of my career. He continued, "Violence I could handle. Shootouts, stabbings, bodies in alleys. That was part of the job. But when Bumpy went silent, it felt like watching a storm gather. You couldn't see it, but you knew it was coming." On the evening of June 16th, something small but significant happened that most people missed. A young courier, no more than 17 years old, delivered a sealed envelope to Detective Weiss at his home. Weiss wasn't on duty. He'd never seen the courier before. The boy handed him the envelope, said, "From Mr. Johnson," and disappeared into the night before Weiss could react. Inside the envelope was a single piece of paper with a handwritten note. Sometimes justice takes care of itself. Watch Mulberry Street. Weiss immediately called his precinct captain. By midnight, plainclothes officers were stationed throughout Little Italy, watching Joey Sabatini's social club. They expected violence, a drive-by shooting, a bombing, maybe even a full-scale assault by Bumpy's crew. Nothing happened that night, or the next morning. By noon on June 17th, 60 hours had passed since the slap. The NYPD was exhausted from high alert. Sabatini's crew was relaxing, interpreting Bumpy's silence as confirmation of their dominance. Even some of Bumpy's allies were beginning to whisper that maybe he'd lost his nerve, that age or circumstance had finally caught up with the man who'd once stood toe-to-toe with Dutch Schultz's operation. Then, at 2:17 p.m. on June 17th, everything changed. But not with gunfire. Joseph Sabatini's downfall began with a man he'd never met. Leonard Rosenberg, a 43-year-old accountant who lived in a modest apartment in the Bronx and had worked for various organized crime figures since 1931. Rosenberg wasn't flashy. He didn't carry guns or collect debts. He was short, balding, wore thick glasses, and had the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after seeing it. But Leonard Rosenberg possessed something far more dangerous than muscle or weapons. He had access to financial records that could destroy careers, end lives, and send powerful men to federal prison for decades. Rosenberg kept books from multiple crime families, a dangerous but lucrative position. He tracked gambling profits, loan sharking operations, and protection rackets. He documented who paid whom, when, and how much. His ledgers were extraordinarily detailed, partially because he was meticulous by nature, but mostly because precision was survival in his line of work. One accounting error could cost him his life. What almost nobody knew, not the Genovese family, not the Luciano organization, not even most of Rosenberg's criminal clients, was that he'd been keeping duplicate records for years. Insurance, he called it. If he was ever arrested or targeted, those records would be his bargaining chip with federal prosecutors. On June 14, 1939, the same day Joey Sabatini slapped Bumpy Johnson, Leonard Rosenberg was working in his apartment, reconciling accounts for various operations across Manhattan. Among those accounts were detailed records of money Joey Sabatini had been skimming from his own family. Sabatini, it turned out, had been stealing for nearly 18 months. The amounts weren't enormous by mob standards, roughly $3,000 per month, equivalent to about $65,000 today. But in the rigid hierarchy of organized crime, where loyalty was absolute and betrayal was punishable by death, even small-scale theft was a capital offense. Sabatini had been covering his tracks carefully, falsifying collection reports, blaming shortfalls on unreliable runners, and pocketing the difference. It had worked because Sabatini was trusted, connected, and arrogant enough to believe he'd never be caught. Leonard Rosenberg discovered the discrepancy on June 13th, while cross-referencing collection reports from different territories. At first, he assumed it was a simple error. But when he dug deeper, comparing Sabatini's reported numbers against actual collections documented by street-level operators, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Rosenberg now faced an impossible choice. If he reported the theft to Sabatini's superiors, he'd be exposing his own access to information he wasn't supposed to have. Crime families didn't appreciate accountants who knew too much. On the other hand, if he stayed silent and the theft was discovered through other means, Rosenberg could be accused of complicity or incompetence. He spent June 14th paralyzed by indecision, sitting in his apartment, staring at the ledgers. Then, on the evening of June 15th, Rosenberg received an unexpected visitor. The man who knocked on his door identified himself only as Marcus. He was well-dressed, polite, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Marcus said he represented a concerned party who had a proposition. According to testimony Rosenberg later gave to federal investigators, Marcus laid out the situation with startling clarity. He knew about Sabatini's theft. He knew Rosenberg had discovered it, and he offered Rosenberg a way out. If Rosenberg provided copies of the relevant financial records, he'd be compensated generously and protected from any blowback. Rosenberg asked who Marcus worked for. Marcus smiled and said, "Does it matter?" The accountant wasn't stupid. He understood that if he refused, he'd likely disappear. If he agreed and got caught, he'd disappear. His only hope was that whoever Marcus represented had enough power to make this transaction worthwhile. He agreed. Over the next 24 hours, Rosenberg made meticulous copies of 6 months' worth of financial records documenting Sabatini's skimming operation. Account numbers, dates, amounts, everything a competent prosecutor or a ruthless crime boss would need to prove theft beyond any doubt. On the afternoon of June 17th, Marcus returned to collect the documents. He handed Rosenberg an envelope containing $5,000 in cash and a train ticket to Chicago, dated for June 20th. Take a vacation, Marcus suggested. 2 weeks minimum, maybe 3. Rosenberg took the money and the ticket. He packed a suitcase that evening. He was gone before sunrise on June 18th. The documents Marcus collected never went to prosecutors. They went to someone far more dangerous. Anthony "Tony Bender" Strollo, one of the most powerful capos in the Genovese crime family and Joey Sabatini's direct superior. Tony Bender Strollo was not a man who tolerated disrespect, disloyalty, or incompetence. Born in 1899, he'd risen through the ranks of organized crime through a combination of intelligence, brutality, and an absolute commitment to the hierarchy that governed mob operations. By 1939, he controlled significant portions of Manhattan's gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering operations, and he reported directly to Vito Genovese himself. Strollo received the financial documents on the evening of June 17th. He reviewed them personally, cross-referencing numbers with his own records. By midnight, he'd confirmed what the documents proved. Joey Sabatini, one of his most trusted captains, had been stealing from the family for over a year. The next morning, June 18th, Strollo summoned Sabatini to a meeting at a restaurant in Greenwich Village. The location was significant, neutral territory away from Sabatini's social club, away from witnesses. 3 other senior members of the Genovese organization were present. Vincent "Jimmy Blue Eyes" Allo, Carlo Marcello, and Thomas "Three-Finger" Lucchese, who represented a neighboring family but had interests that overlapped with Genovese operations. According to later testimony from a waiter who was paid to leave the back room, but who listened through the kitchen door, the meeting lasted less than 30 minutes. Strollo laid out the evidence calmly and systematically. Dates, amounts, locations. The discrepancies were undeniable. Sabatini initially tried to deny everything, then blamed his subordinates, then finally admitted to minor accounting errors while insisting he planned to correct them. Nobody believed him. Vincent Allo, who'd known Sabatini since 1932, asked a single question. "Did you think we were stupid, Joey, or did you just stop caring?" Sabatini had no answer. The decision was unanimous. In the rigid code that governed organized crime, there was only one punishment for theft from the family. But Strollo made an unusual choice about timing and method. Typically, someone in Sabatini's position would be killed immediately, a bullet to the head, a body left as a warning. But Strollo was both practical and politically savvy. Sabatini's death would create complications. His crew was loyal. His family connections ran deep. Killing him without proper justification would raise questions and potentially spark internal conflict. Strollo decided on a different approach. Sabatini was stripped of his rank immediately. His territories were reassigned. His crew was dissolved and distributed among other captains. Effective immediately, Joey Sabatini was no longer a made man, no longer protected by family hierarchy, no longer relevant to organized crime operations in New York. He was, in the language of the underworld, clipped, not killed, but erased. By the afternoon of June 18th, word had spread throughout Little Italy and beyond. Joey Sabatini, the man who'd slapped Bumpy Johnson with such public arrogance 4 days earlier, had been demoted to nothing. He was forbidden from conducting any business, collecting any debts, or representing himself as connected to any crime family. The humiliation was absolute and intentional. Strollo made one final decision that afternoon. He sent a message to Harlem, delivered by a neutral intermediary to a nightclub where Bumpy Johnson was known to spend his evenings. The message was simple. The matter has been addressed. We appreciate the information. Bumpy never publicly acknowledged receiving that message. But witnesses reported that when he heard the news about Sabatini, he simply nodded once, adjusted his hat, and continued his conversation as if nothing significant had happened. NYPD Detective Harold Weiss, who'd been monitoring both sides throughout the entire incident, later wrote in his memoirs that he finally understood what Bumpy had done. He didn't need to kill Sabatini, Weiss wrote. He did something worse. He made Sabatini worthless. Joey Sabatini disappeared from public life after June 18, 1939. For a man who'd spent years building a reputation through intimidation and violence, the sudden erasure was unbearable. According to police reports, Sabatini attempted to contact old associates, looking for work, looking for respect, looking for any acknowledgement that he'd once mattered. Nobody would speak with him. Mob-connected businesses refused to serve him. Former allies crossed the street to avoid eye contact. On July 3, 1939, Sabatini's body was discovered in a flophouse in Newark, New Jersey. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by gunshot. A single bullet to the head. No witnesses. No investigation beyond routine police procedure. Some historians argue Sabatini was murdered, that the mob ordered his death after all. Others claim he genuinely took his own life, unable to live with the humiliation of losing everything he'd built. The truth, like so many aspects of this story, remains disputed. What's undisputed is this. Bumpy Johnson had accomplished something extraordinary. He'd responded to a public assault not with violence, but with precision, intelligence, and political maneuvering that destroyed his enemy more thoroughly than any bullet could have. The message sent throughout organized crime was clear. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just muscle. He wasn't just an enforcer from Harlem who operated at the pleasure of Italian bosses. He was a strategist who understood how power actually worked, through information, leverage, and patience. The two police officers who'd witnessed the original slap, Patrolman O'Reilly and Robertson, filed supplemental reports after Sabatini's death. O'Reilly's report included a remarkable observation. In retrospect, Officer Chun and I may have witnessed the moment Johnson decided not to react physically precisely because he'd already decided on a more effective response. His stillness wasn't restraint. It was calculation. Bumpy's reputation in Harlem grew even larger after the incident. Street operators understood that he'd outplayed a connected Italian mobster without firing a shot. The black community saw him as someone who'd stood up to racist disrespect using intelligence rather than violence, a victory with deeper significance during an era of systematic oppression. Within the Italian crime families, attitudes toward Bumpy shifted. He was no longer viewed as just a useful black gangster who controlled Harlem operations. He became someone to be dealt with carefully, someone whose strategic thinking rivaled their own. Stephanie St. Clair, who'd mentored Bumpy years earlier, reportedly told him during a private meeting shortly after Sabatini's death, "You finally learned the most important lesson. Power isn't about who can hurt who. It's about who can see 3 moves ahead." The NYPD, meanwhile, learned its own lesson. Lieutenant Frank Mancini, who'd expected violence and prepared for gang warfare, revised his assessment of Bumpy Johnson in internal reports. "Johnson represents a new type of criminal," Mancini wrote in August 1939. "Not less dangerous, but more sophisticated. Traditional law enforcement approaches may prove inadequate. Mancini was right. Over the next 2 decades, Bumpy would continue operating in Harlem, building an empire that blended legitimate businesses with illegal operations, maintaining relationships with both black activists and white mobsters, and becoming the kind of power broker that defied simple categorization. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson continued his operations in Harlem for nearly 3 more decades after the Sabatini incident. His life was complex, contradictory, and impossible to reduce to simple hero or villain narratives. He served 2 prison sentences, one from 1951 to 1963 for narcotics conspiracy, another shorter stint in 1967. During his time in Alcatraz, he became friends with Alvin "Creepy" Karpis and cultivated a reputation as an intelligent, disciplined prisoner who read voraciously and taught chess to younger inmates. After his release in 1963, Bumpy returned to Harlem and found a neighborhood transformed by the civil rights movement. The power dynamics he'd navigated so carefully for decades were shifting. Italian mob control was weakening. New players, younger, more violent, less interested in old hierarchies, were emerging. Bumpy adapted. He mentored a young street dealer named Frank Lucas, who would later claim to have built a heroin empire using Bumpy strategies. He consulted with black activists, including Malcolm X, who recognized Bumpy's street credibility and sought his advice on community safety. He maintained relationships with Italian mobsters while quietly supporting black-owned businesses and community programs. On July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson suffered a heart attack while eating breakfast at Wells Restaurant in Harlem. He was 62 years old. He died before the ambulance arrived. Over 1,000 people attended his funeral at St. Martin's Episcopal Church. The mourners included street operators, community activists, legitimate business people, and multiple individuals suspected of organized crime connections. No Italian mob representatives were reported in attendance, but flowers arrived from several New York crime families with cards that simply read, "With respect." The incident with Joey Sabatini had occurred 29 years before Bumpy's death, but remained a defining moment in how he was remembered. It represented everything that made him legendary: his refusal to be intimidated, his strategic thinking, his ability to turn apparent weakness into devastating strength. But we should be careful about romanticizing this story. Bumpy Johnson was involved in narcotics trafficking, illegal gambling, and violent enforcement of criminal operations. People died because of decisions he made. Families were destroyed by the heroin that flowed through networks he protected. His intelligence and strategic thinking don't erase the harm his actions caused. The same is true of the figures around him. Stephanie St. Clair, brilliant as she was, ran an illegal gambling operation that exploited poor communities. The Italian mobsters Bumpy outmaneuvered were murderers, extortionists, and predators. Even the good figures in this story, reform-minded police officers, community activists, operated in morally complicated circumstances where clear ethical lines were impossible to draw. What happened on Lenox Avenue on June 14, 1939, was real. The slap happened. The response happened. The consequences were documented in police reports, newspaper accounts, and later testimony from multiple witnesses. But the meaning of those events remains contested. To some, Bumpy's response represents black resistance against white supremacy in organized crime, a refusal to accept the racial hierarchies that even criminal enterprises enforced. To others, it's simply a story about one criminal outmaneuvering another, with no larger moral significance beyond tactical victory. Perhaps it's both. Perhaps it's neither. What's certain is this: in a world governed by violence, intimidation, and physical power, Bumpy Johnson proved that patience, information, and strategic thinking could be just as devastating as any weapon. He understood that real power isn't demonstrated through immediate reaction, but through the ability to destroy your enemies while keeping your hands clean. The police froze after Sabatini's slap because they sensed something the mob capo missed. Bumpy's silence wasn't submission. It was a promise. And unlike the loud, immediate violence that defines so much of organized crime, Bumpy kept his promises quietly, completely, and with a precision that made his enemies disappear without him ever pulling a trigger. That's what made him legendary. That's what made him dangerous. And that's why, more than 50 years after his death, we're still telling his story.